Welcome to Taking the Tradition On. We're in series 5 with soul stories. As always, I'd like to thank my amazing patrons. Got a couple online here. Hello, Cecilia, for who make this possible and doable. It is free to everybody at any time, and there's a fantastic archive now on the Taking the Tradition On YouTube site. So if you enjoyed tonight and you haven't heard some of the others, do go back and have a scroll through. There are some amazing people up in the archive if you want to go and have a look. I'd also like to say thank you to Get a Word in Edgeways. I'm using their very snazzy Zoom account with the webinar function. So thank you very much to them for letting me borrow the Zoom. So in this series, each month I'm inviting a very eminent storyteller to tell some or all of a story that has become one of their soul stories, one of those stories that has become part of them, that has travelled with them on their journey as a storyteller. They keep coming back to, exploring what drew them to that story, what that story means to them, and how their relationship with it has changed over time. And I'm very, very excited about tonight's guest. We have the wonderful Welsh wordsmith, a performance storyteller who's travelled the world, evoking the beauty and the bleakness of Welsh landscape and story. He's insightful, he's witty, he's completely spellbinding in a way that word's used a lot, but there is a spell that is cast that is between the word and the landscape. And he's basically completely brilliant. So please put your hands together, go wild on the chat for the amazing Michael Harvey. Welcome back, Michael.
And thank you so much for that lovely welcome, Amy. It's great to be here with you and with everyone else. And I'm absolutely chuffed because I can't believe how many series of Taking the Tradition On you've done.
Neither
Uh,
can I.
well, no, in a good way, right? But it's an amazing achievement, and I think everyone here takes their metaphorical or otherwise hats off to you because it's not just taking the tradition on; it's taking the tradition for a run round the park in a wheelbarrow of gorgeousness.
Well, thank you. And obviously, we've just been practicing up to this point, so that now we can have you. And sort of a drum roll is your story, your soul story is Branwen. And I think there are quite a few people here who will know a little bit of the story of Branwen, maybe one or two who know it really well, and some who have no idea who Branwen is or the background of the story. So if we're going to be discussing it and talking about it, I think I'm just going to hand over to you to give us a little bit of a background of what the story is and where it comes from. And Branwen's quite a big story, so I don't think we're going to be able to have all of it tonight, sadly. But if you could tell us one of your favourite bits of it, and then hopefully we'll have time to revisit it and have a bit more story later on.
That'd be great. That'd be fantastic. But before we do any of that, something even more important: geography. Not everyone knows where the bits and bobs of Wales actually are, especially with the story. So this is Wales, Cymru, as it's called in Wales, Wales, as it's called by other people. So what we've got here up the top corner, we've got Anglesey. This is the Cardigan Bay down there. Sorry, I can't. It's the right way around to you. It's the wrong way around for me, and it's quite tricky to get your finger in the right place. So this is Cardigan Bay. Harlech is about there. Harlech is a gorgeous place just on the coast. Then another very important place is here, which is Pembrokeshire. And if you go that way, you will end up where? In Ireland. That's also quite important as well, just so you're aware of what the geography is. And later on, we're going to be going back from Pembrokeshire and we're going to go eastwards. And that's a little bit I've added on, but I think it makes complete sense. And I think you might agree when I finally come to that bit, if indeed we do get to that bit. So, 6 men stand around a newly dug grave. There's a king, there's a poet, and the others are all warriors. They have just finished burying the head of their king. And they stop. They pause to remember. So we're going back to Harlech now. Harlech, this beautiful town on the sea. On a very clear day, you might be able to make out Ireland, but that's where the story starts, and it's Bendigeid Bran. Bendigeid Bran is a big man. Not only is he a big man, he's a giant of a man. He's so big that he cannot fit into any building that had ever been created in that time. So, when it was wet and rainy, they would make a big tent, and Bendigeid Bran would sit in it with all his advisors around him and all his family around him. But when the sun shone, and when this story starts, the sun is shining. When the sun is shining, they sit outside. They sit on the top of the cliff in Harlech, as some of you may well have done. And you look out westwards towards the sea, and there's the sea stretching forever. And Bendigeid Bran sitting there with all his advisors and family around him, and they're discussing how best to rule the land, when suddenly Bendigeid Bran stops talking. He stares over the heads of his family and companions, and he sees something. And because the king has seen something, everyone turns to look. And now they see it. It's getting closer and closer. They're not quite sure what it is. Oh, it has a sail. It's a boat. And the boat gets closer and closer. And before long, they realize that this boat, this ship, is the most beautiful and the finest ship that any of them have ever seen. And it's going faster than any ship they've ever seen. And as it gets closer, they see it's not one ship, it's 13 ships. 13 sails on 13 ships getting closer and closer and closer until they stop within hailing distance of the shore. And at the front of the first boat is a man, clearly a king, holding up a shield upside down. And in those times, that was a sign of peace. So Bendigeid Bran and his family and followers looked down. The man in the boat put his shield down and said, "I come in peace. If you give me the thing that I want, your land and my land, Ireland and Wales, will live together in peace and harmony." Bendigeid Bran looked down and said, "I am interested in what you have to say, and I give you permission to step onto my land." Matholwch, the Irish king, stepped onto Welsh soil. And before long, they were talking and laughing and drinking and eating, until eventually Bendigeid Bran said to Matholwch, "Why are you here? It is time for us to work together. And this is what I suggest," said Matholwch, the Irish king. "Your sister, Branwen, will marry me. Then our two countries, our two islands, will grow together in peace and harmony. What do you say?" "I say if we're going to do that," says Bendigeid Bran, "we should do it somewhere special, and we should have a feast. So you take your Irish in your ships and you sail round the Llŷn Peninsula all the way to Anglesey, and we'll meet you there in Aberfraw. You sail, we'll walk, and we'll see who gets there first." So the Irish, they turned their ships and they started to sail away around the Llŷn Peninsula. And the Welsh, they started to march. They got to the Menai Straits, and then the water was shallower than it is now, and they could just walk straight across. And they're both camps, the Irish and the Welsh, make for Aberfraw. Meanwhile, in Aberfraw, a huge tent is raised, and the Irish and the Welsh, Bendigeid Bran and Matholwch and their followers arrive at exactly the same time. Inside they go. There's feasting, there's laughter, there's singing. There is such celebration. And Bendigeid Bran looks at Matholwch and he says to himself, "I have never seen a better man than this. Yes, this Matholwch. He will marry my sister Branwen." And suddenly, this party, this knees up, became a wedding. And Matholwch and Branwen were married, as were the two countries. Everyone was happy. Everyone felt that this was the right thing to do. Everyone agreed. Apart from one person. Why? He said. Why? Should this woman be given away? This woman, my half-sister, be given away to a foreigner and a stranger. This I do not accept. The man's name was Evnissien. He had a half-brother called Nissien. Now, it's quite easy to remember who's who. Nissien is the nice one. Evnissien is the not nice one. And Evnissien, he left the party. He left the celebration and he went for a walk. And he walked a long, long way. And he walked and walked for a long, long time, days. He's walking through a woodland. He turns his head and he sees, in the morning light, he sees a stable. In front of the stable, there are the most beautiful horses he has ever seen in his entire life. He walks towards them. The closer he gets, the more beautiful and strong and haughty they appear. And he sees a stable boy nearby and he says, "Tell me, friend, whose horses are these?" And the stranger looks at Evnissien and says, "Why, these horses, you must know. These horses belong to Matholwch." "You know, Matholwch. You know, the Irish king. You know, who's just married Branwen." "And so she is married," said Evnissien to himself. He said nothing. He just walked into the forest and he waited in the gloom of the shadows of the trees as it got darker, as the shadows lengthened, and he seemed to disappear into the woodland, but he was there watching and waiting until every light in the castle went out. He gave it a few more moments and then drew his knife, and he walked towards, not the castle, the stable. He opened the stable door and he went inside and he breathed in the thick, heady, earthy smell of horses. And then he reached out into the darkness and there he calmed a horse, stroking its neck, taking his hand along its back towards its tail, and then with his knife he cut off the tail of the horse. The horse turned in panic and he grabbed hold of the horse's head and cut off the ears of the horse. And then where he could get hold of them, he even took hold of the lips of the horses and cut them off. And where he could, he cut off the eyelids of the horses. And he walked out of that place singing. The next morning was chaos. There's blood everywhere, these dead horses. Matholwch came to see for himself and he said, "What kind of place is this? And one day I get married to a beautiful princess and the next my horses are destroyed. We will leave." And they started to go. The Irishmen, they got ready and they went back to their ships and they were ready to sail. Nissien was sent after them. Nissien and Manawydan. And they said to them, "Look, listen, this is a terrible thing. We will make sure that you get things in recompense for the loss you have suffered. These are the things that we will give you. A fit and healthy horse for every one that was destroyed. That you shall get. If that does not satisfy you, you can take your pick of all the horses in Wales if you want. We don't care. You can take them all. And on top of that, we will give you a rod of silver as thick as your thumb and as tall as yourself. And we will give you a silver plate, beaten silver as wide as your own face, if you just stay." So Bendigeidfran and the other Welsh leaders, they discussed and they said, "All right, this is a bargain. They will stay and we will feast." But the feast, it was a disaster. No one was eating, no one was singing, no one was making jokes. There was no fun, there was no frivolity, there was no exuberance. Why? Because no one wanted this. And Bendigeidfran turned to Matholwch, the Irish king, and saw that he had hardly touched his food. He hadn't even sipped his wine. And he realized that he had made a mistake. And he turned to the king, his brother King Matholwch, and said, "Your Majesty, my friend, my fellow king, I understand your sorrow and your loss, and I will give you something that you will prize above all things. I will give you a pyre dadeni, the cauldron of rebirth. But I'm surprised, said Bendigeidfran, that you, Matholwch, have not heard about this great cauldron, because it is from Ireland that I got it. And for the first time that evening, Matholwch spoke, and he said, I know all about that cauldron. And then he told the story of how the cauldron came to Ireland. But actually, that's a story I'm not going to tell because it's going to just take us over time, I think. So I hope you forgive me. Another time I will tell you about how the cauldron was brought to Britain and Wales. But yeah. Should we have a little mini chat here, or?
Yes. So, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in all of that startup, Branwen's mentioned very little. She's referred to, but we haven't actually met her. We know nothing about her. We haven't, she's been referred to, but she's not actually in the story at all. And it is quite a hard story, and it is quite shocking. And it's really interesting that you've chosen such a shocking story as your soul story. So it's interesting. What is it that makes this your soul story? Why do you keep coming back?
Well, I keep coming back because it works, and I often am surprised that it works because of the content, and there's no bad things happen. Lots of bad things happen, and there's a kind of logic to the bad things happening, whereby there are certain actors in the story who make really bad things happen, and there's nothing in place to put the brakes on them. So one of the things I think that is really interesting for me in this story is like, what happens when power goes, when there's power overreach, and how do you cope with that? How do you, because it's actually, I mean, there's some even bigger things happening later on, which are just insane and massively horrible. There's one point in the story when the story moves to Ireland where there's a battle, and the end of the battle is there's a point where, okay, there are 7 survivors on the Welsh side, including Branwen, but on the Irish side, everyone is dead. Everyone in the whole of the island of Ireland is dead, apart from, I think it's 5 pregnant women who hang out in a cave. They give birth to 5 children, and those 5 children become the counties of Ireland, the old counties. So there's this what's the word I'm looking for? There's a kind of rigor to the story. The story doesn't care about our feelings, but it's telling us a truth that is vital for survival. What do you do when people start killing each other? How do you keep things together? What actions can we take now when we're not actually in a place where everyone is fighting, in where we are right now? What are the actions that we can take to ensure some kind of lasting peace? Or what are the ways towards peace in a time of violence?
And that's the thing, is that nobody in this story wants war.
Exactly.
At no point does anyone in this story want war, apart from, well, possibly Efnisien.
Efnisien sacrifices himself. So I'm wondering what to do now. Maybe because that's a very interesting bit of the story, but I'm wondering if we should do it in order. Would people be interested in, actually, because we talked about the fact that there's the lack of women in the story and the lack of agency, but there is the story of Branwen, who what happens is, see, I'm doing it now. What happens?
I was saying about the beginning of the story. Yes, she does come into it. It just takes a while to
yeah. So Branwen goes, and it's all perfect. Her heir, her child, the child that she has, will be the monarch of both Britain and Ireland. Joint citizenship, joint cultural whatever, and it's all looking really, really good. But in the process of the negotiations to make sure that everyone was still happy and Branwen could go back to Ireland with Matholwch, they forgot about Efnisien. And Efnisien was still alive. Efnisien was just hanging around. And this time it was the Irish who were saying, well, hang on, what's happened about Efnisien? Efnisien has not been punished. Yes, we have been given goods and chattels and silver and gold. But what about the insult to us as people, our pride? Because the man who did this thing to our horses is still alive and well. We can't punish him from here, but there is someone we can punish. Branwen. So she goes from being a queen to having her royal clothes stripped from her, wearing rags. She can't go into any of the royal parts of the palace. Her job is this: to get up earlier than anyone else in the morning, sleeping on flagstones, getting up and kneading the dough to make the bread that she will not eat. She needs the dough, she needs the dough, she needs the dough. And every single day the butcher comes, and the butcher's job is to cut up the meat, which of course she will not eat. And with his bloodied hand, his job is to smack her across her face every single day. And every single day she kneads the dough. Every single day she takes her slap. And every single day, day after day, it's the same every day until one day. She's by an open window. She's kneading the dough. There's a flicker of something. She turns and she sees a starling close up. When you see them in a cloud moving in that amazing way, they're incredible. When you see them in a tree, they actually look like scaggy, raggy, little kind of slightly disreputable looking birds. But when you get close up and you look at their feathers, there's this iridescent rainbow gleam on them, like oil on water. Absolutely stunning. And the other great thing about them is they're always talking to each other. Anyway, Branwen is kneading the dough. She's keeping her head down. She doesn't want another slap. She sees this thing in the corner of her eye. She pretends not to take any notice. And it's a starling. And she looks at the starling and she sees the iridescence in its feathers. And she looks again, the birds go. The next day, she's kneading the dough again. The bird comes. And this time it has a good look at her before flying away. The next day it comes and she's already rolled a tiny little crumb of dough and put it on the side of the table. And the bird sees it, hops onto the table, pecks, flies away. Every single day, the bird comes back. And by this time, she's had a son called Gwern, and she hasn't seen him for 2 years. She knows that he's somewhere in the palace. Sometimes she imagines that she can hear a child's voice, and that child's voice might be her child, but she just doesn't know. So she kneads the dough and she talks to the bird. And every day the bird comes back. And every day she talks to the bird. One day, she's there kneading the dough, waiting for her friend, the bird, to come. And it lands on the window ledge. No glass in those days, of course. And from there, hops onto the table. It has a little peck at a little ball of dough. And then it jumps onto the kneading trough and looks at her. And she looks at the bird and she realizes, this bird can understand every word I say. And being very, very careful not to be observed, she looked around the scullery until she found a piece of paper. She scratched a little message on it. She tied it tight. She twisted it. She found some string or a little bond of leather and tied it to the bird's wing. And she said, go to my brother. Go to Bendigade Vran. And that little bird with the message on its wing, it flew out of the window and it flew over the land and it flew over the sea. And it flew and it flew and it flew with the great waves tossing beneath it. It flew and it flew until the sun began to rise. And there it could see the landscape of Wales. And as it got closer, near the shore, there was a huge tent. That's where he was told to go. And this little bird flew down straight into the tent. The place was packed with people. And this little bird flew straight towards Bendigeidfran, landed on his shoulder, gave his wings a little ruffle, and Bendigeidfran looked down and saw a thing attached to the bird's wing. He took it, unfolded it, read it, and he knew what he had to do. He burst out of the court, he burst out of that tent, and he called his army and he called his navy. And all the men, they got into the ships, and the ships started to sail. Bendigeidfran, he's far too big, he's a giant, he can't fit inside any ship. He doesn't need to. As the ships sail towards Ireland, Bendigeidfran walks through the sea, the Irish Sea coming up to his chest. And because he was a musically minded kind of giant, he put his harpists on his head so that they could play as he walked. The next morning in Wales, there were a couple of swineherds, and they're doing their work. They're on top of a cliff. It's quite misty. Oh my God, there's something in the middle of the sea that wasn't there before. There's a mountain. There's a huge mountain in the middle of the sea. It wasn't there yesterday. And then they noticed that around the mountain appears to be a forest. And in the middle of the mountain, in the forest, there are two huge lakes, and there's a ridge. There's a big ridge as well, and the whole thing seems to be getting closer and closer and closer, and they don't know what to do, and they call for help. People come, and none of them have any explanation. They call the king, Matholwch, the Irish king, comes, and they say, "Your Majesty, what is this strange portent?" And he says, "I've got no idea what on earth it is." It gets closer and closer. Then someone has the bright idea. Ask Branwen. And for the first time in many years, Branwen comes out of the castle, out of the scullery where she was kept. And she walks to the shore, and she brushes the dough off her apron. And the others ask her, "Your Majesty, do you know what these things are?" And she smiles and she says, "Although I am no longer your Majesty, yet I do know what these things are." The forest is not a forest. The mountain is not a mountain. The mountain is my brother. That ridge you see is his frown. Those lakes you see are his eyes. And the forest, those are the masts on my brother's ships, holding my brother's army, and he will soon be here. And Matholwch turned to his advisors and said, "What shall we do?" And his advisors were unanimous. "Run." So they did. They ran and they ran and they ran. Not in a scattered way. They weren't panicking. They were going to somewhere they knew they would be safe. On the other side of the river Shannon, or the river Llynon, as it's called in Welsh. They got there. They crossed the bridges over the river Shannon, of which there are many, and smashed them. Every single one. Why? Because you cannot cross that river with a boat. You cannot swim across, because at its bottom there are sucking stones. And if you try to swim, or if you try to go across the river using anything other than a bridge, you will be dragged down to the bottom of the river and you will drown. So what did the Irish do? They crossed the Shannon. They smashed every bridge. And the Welsh arrive, led by Bendigeidfran. And they know the stories of this place, and they know they cannot cross. They turn to the king and say, "What is your advice about a bridge?" And Bendigeidfran says, "Just this." He knelt down. His great knees sunk into the mud of the banks of the Shannon. And then he lifted his hands up, lifted his arms high, then he reached right across, and with his fingers he grabbed hold of the other side, of the other bank of the river, and he hauled himself across. And as he hauled himself across, he said the words, "A vo ben bid bont." He who would be a leader, let him be a bridge. And his army climbed over his back, marched over his back, and when the last soldier jumped down, Bendigeid Branwen got to his feet, stepped across the Shannon, and led his army towards the Irish.
I don't want to stop you because it's a fantastic story, but at the same time, I want to have some time to talk about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting. I mean, that's become one of the most famous Welsh sayings, I think, really. It's such a famous Welsh proverb now. Does everybody in Wales know where it comes from? I mean, because I think everybody does know the proverb.
Well, I know there are lots of schools who have Avo Bid Bent as a Avo Ben Bid Bont as a motto, but it's interesting. I told that story to year 5 and up, and they all get it, and I think pretty sure it's still with them, but that's the minority of people. There are some great picture books of the story, but many of them, I think, aim at too young an age group. Because it's just not a kid's story. But
why would you aim?
Exactly.
Why you would aim that at
Yeah.
small children?
Yeah. No, there are picture books beautifully made, but they have to completely eviscerate the story in order to allow it to be read by and listened to by younger children. But for me, something happens in year 5, and they're up for it, and they also have the resilience to not be freaked out about it. I think they are more matter of fact than adults, in fact. So later on, there's a child murder involving fire. I've never had a year 5, year 6 audience troubled by that at all.
Just out of interest, I'm just going to ask you on the chat, how many people here know the story, and how many people is this a new story for? Just let us know if you know. If you know what we're talking about already, or if you're just seeing it through the filter of Michael. It's new to Selena, new to Richard Hamilton. Oh, so lots of people saying,
"Oh wow,
wow!" So it's new to lots of people. So Cecilia's the first person so far who knows the story.
Okay, well,
I think it's also worth saying where it comes from, and that it's about its, its provenance, because it is one of the Welsh stories.
So there were lots of manuscripts, Welsh manuscripts in bits and pieces all over the place, but the 2 major ones that scholars have really pored over are the Red Book of Hergest and the White Book of Rhydderch, and they're named after the places where they were found. And they are parallel. I think one of them is slightly more complete than the other. And the other really confusing thing is Mabinogi and Mabinogion. So the Mabinogion is a collection of 13 separate tales, 4 of which are the Mabinogi. So you've got the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, and they are all related. And they feel to me as if they go from 1 to 4 in a historical sequence. The Mabinogion also includes some much later stuff. So there were Welsh versions of the Percival myth and all that kind of thing, and lots of other stories.
So they're really ancient stories. So the kind of the first recorded stories of the Isle of Britain.
Yeah.
The first places where Arthur is mentioned, and they are although they're the Welsh stories, because Wales was much larger and Cymru was much larger, and obviously kind of England wasn't a thing. They're the older stories of this island, and they are part wonder tale, part creation myth, part historical. Is that fair summing up? Very briefly.
So, and also I think there's something about the manuscript tradition whereby I think they weren't read. Well, but yeah, they were read, but I think they were debated over. I think they were, in my head, what I would imagine is that people say, oh, wait a minute, that can't be right, da, 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 da. And there'd be a big argument about it. and also it's the stories are incomplete without an audience, either an audience listening or an audience listening and going, actually, yeah, that makes me think about this other thing in my life that I should sort out. But they were aimed, as far as I am aware, at a highborn and noble class of people. There were bits of it that kind of have echoes of Wonder Tale. So, for example, the longest tale in the Mabinogion is Culhwch and Olwen, and that includes a lot more Wonder Tale stuff, although it's mainly about the highborn and aristocracy. There are moments in it of something a bit deeper and older. I mean, the moment in Culhwch and Olwen that bridges that gap is so there's the giant called Ysbyddaden Bencawr, and the heroes go to sort him out, and at one point the giant throws a poisoned stone-tipped spear at the hero Culhwch, and lots of other things have happened around it, but this is Culhwch's moment, and he's got his back turned to the giant. The spear is coming. It's a stone-tipped, poisoned spear, old style, old school. He grabs it, turns, and throws it straight back at the giant. When it is thrown, and there's no explanation for this, when the stone-tipped spear is thrown back at the giant, it turns into iron on its journey. And he gets hit 3 times. He gets hit once in his knee, once in his chest, and once in his eye, and has his head pinned to the back of his chair. So it's a kind of compression of culture change, that moment when, because everyone who's hunting and looking for Olwen, they're all definitely Iron Age type people with a big shiny iron swords and all the rest. But they meet someone who doesn't know iron, and they show the old school people of this land what iron can do.
And it's a moment of death of wonder as well, isn't it? Of all that's the beginning of the end of the Fae folk and the Tulithterg and all of them, the people of the other world and the leaving of the other world. And Branwen fits into this cycle of mythology. This story is a really essential part of that whole historical wonder narrative. And some of it may be true, and some of, a lot of it is, well, there's different versions of what true is. Some of it is perhaps historical.
Definitely true.
Yeah, definitely true. And interesting, because we have another giant in this story. There are a lot of giants in the Mabinogi, and I think once you get into English mythology, I'm not sure about other places in the world, but in English mythology, giants are often shown as being stupid, and that is not the case in Welsh mythology. The size of a person is partly an outward reflection of the size of their internal capacity and their internal being. Bendigeidfran is a giant in all senses of the world. He is the king. He is a giant personality. He is a giant of wisdom. He is a giant of honor, and he is a giant physically. And that is an outward showing of everything. To be able to fit everything that he is in, he has to be a giant.
Yeah, exactly. If he was a normal size, you wouldn't buy it, would he? He's got to be 50 feet tall.
But the women aren't always giant. There are giant women within it. And I mean, Branwen is put into hideous situations within this, but she is a hero in a different way. And she is strong and she is wise and she never gives up, though admittedly it probably would have been much better for her if she kept her mouth shut when they asked what she could see coming and didn't give them chance to prepare.
Actually, yeah, you're right. She said, I can't, I've got the wrong glasses on today. I can't see what you're seeing. Just relax, it'll be fine.
Yeah, or even, I know what it is. Why should I tell you? I mean, it's just like, but she has to have that moment of just, that's her moment.
I think there's a moment there when maybe this is her prompting a battle, which does actually happen later. And is horrible. Everyone is killed apart from 7 survivors. And Branwen is one of them. And her son is thrown into a fire.
And so we haven't got time to tell the whole story, but what it is this is you're probably getting the idea of this already. It's very political, and it's just it's like watching a car crash in slow motion.
Mm.
It's from the moment the story starts, it's inevitable. People have to follow their courses because of their position, their honor, that they feel like they're constrained into narrow courses of action, apart from Efnisien, who is the wild card who kind of sets everything in motion. And everybody else has to respond to him in a certain way to fulfill honor and duty and familial bonds. And nobody wants a war. Absolutely nobody in the story wants a war. And yet it's unavoidable, inescapable. They don't know how to get out of it.
And it is this question. I mean, I don't know if other people are aware of the work of Gwilym Morris Baird. Gwilym is a very, very interesting man, and very scholarly as well. He's and as well as being a musician. His take on all that is very interesting. He reckons that these stories are basically teaching stories for the armed aristocracy, which is about how you work with power. And some of that power is military, but also it's strategic and tactical, and it's about getting what you want with what you've got. And I think there's partly these stories are a list of things not to do, but at the same time, we get ourselves in really bad situations, particularly if we're powerful. Now, I think for people like us, if I can just expand from my own personal point of view, is we're all incredibly privileged, but don't realise we have all this power. Whereas what's great about this story is that the power is naked. You can feel it when it's in the room, and that there's no ambiguity there at all. And I think a lot of it is about how do you deal with power, particularly potentially bad and explosive power, harmful power, and power that will re-traumatize people. And there's no answer. We have to work. I mean, I don't want to come back to it because the whole thing is playing out in the Middle East. And from our point of view here, we can just say, "What have you thought of not killing each other?" And that's just that's not an answer. It's too complicated for that kind of response. Yeah, that would be great if we could flick a switch and make everyone nice. Yeah, but we can't. And I think there's something very grown up about these stories, where they don't make it easy for you. And if Gwilym is right, and these are teaching stories for highborn people, for the armed aristocracy, it's about, okay, how do you deal with a situation that feels almost impossible? And in a way, these stories are coming back into their power, because our world is actually, sadly, getting more like it. And we might have things to learn from what goes on in these stories. And the other thing about this story, is what happens later, which is the importance of Anuvn, the other world, where the seventh Branwen dies, but the rest of them, of the survivors, they have these two massive trips. They end up in Harlech, and they forget all their sorrow. They are sung to by the birds of Rhiannon, who's a kind of horse goddess, and they eat and they feast for I think it's 7 years, and none of them get older. And then the head, because the head is now severed but talking, says, now we need to go to
the head of Bendigeidfran, this is
down the bottom. So they walk from Harlech carrying a head all the way to Pembrokeshire. Then they get in a boat and they go west to Gwales, which is an island, a real island off the coast of Pembrokeshire, but it's beyond the horizon. And I've actually been there on a, not on it, but round it on a boat. It's an extraordinary place. They arrive, the survivors. They get up to the top of um, the island, and there's a hall. They open the door. There's food. There's wine. There's a fire. Everything is perfect, and they stay there eating and drinking and telling stories and having a great time for 80 years. None of them get a single day older.
And they also, when they step into that place, they have forgotten everything. They
Absolutely.
forget the war, they forget all of their sorrow. And there's just one thing they have to not do, isn't there?
There are three doors. One of them they mustn't open. And there's this guy called Halin Fab Gwyn Hyn. And he says to himself, he has this brilliant line, shame on me if shame on my beard if I don't see, you don't hear that enough these days, do you? Shame on my beard if I do not go and see if it's true what they say about this door. So he walked straight towards it, boom, opened it, remembered everything. And he turns, and all his companions are pushing away the food and the wine. And they turn to the head, and the head's huge eyes are slowly shutting. The colour is draining from its face, and it's dead. So they pick it up, and they carry it down to the ship that had been waiting there for 80 years. They sail back to the mainland. Now, the next bit is not in the Mabinogi, but it must have happened. So they pick it up, and they go eastwards, because they're on a mission. They go eastwards, eastwards, eastwards. Now, carrying a head, a giant head, I mean, half the size of a house, is difficult. You can't go very far. And by the end of the day, you're knackered. So, of course, they would have stopped somewhere. And the villagers would have come out, the people would have come out the castles and go, notice you've got a big head there. What's the story behind that? And they would have told the story. They would have been fed. They would have had somewhere to stay. They would have had a drink. And the next day, they would have gone eastwards again and again and again and again until they end up walking along the north, I think, bank of the Thames. And then the Isle of Dogs does that weird bit. And that is where the Tower of London is. And that's where those men stood in a circle. They took the head, they buried it as deep under the ground as it had once been above it. They filled in the grave. And they stood there and waited until in turn each went and walked their separate way.
And the head's still there, they say.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, actually, there's a kind of side story that King Arthur had heard all this bloody story about the heads, because the head is buried there. The island of Britain will be safe from invaders. So King Arthur dug it up. And the rest is history. Not his greatest move.
Right. I didn't know that bit, because obviously the ravens are still there. But there is.
Well, actually, do you want to tell people about ravens and Bendigeidfran? Because that's really important.
You go for it.
Okay, so Bendigeidfran means blessed crow. There are ravens, which are like full-on crows, at the Tower of London, and they have been there for a very, 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 very long time. And the idea is that these ravens are the totem animals of Bendigeidfran, on whose grave they live. And the other story is that should the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, the island of Britain will fall.
So the head may have gone, but the ravens are still there. But that is the thing, is there's a very definite point in this story where it's very much kind of connected with the land, connected really with this world, and it's about war and mortality and love and politics and honour. And then there's a moment where we just step into the other world. And one of the things that we were sort of starting to talk about this story, and one of the when I was saying, why is it your soul story, is because there's that moment of healing, and that moment that is completely weird but makes sense in your soul and your heart, even if it doesn't always make sense when you're telling it in people's heads, but it does in the sense of the story. And it's one of those things that's why you need story. because you can't necessarily explain it in everyday language.
No, and that's the point. It has a power and a resonance that's outside what we normally experience. Um, and it's deeply irrational. People's motives are clear and declared. There's no kind of working out what people are thinking because they just crack on and do stuff, whether it's great or horrible. So it's refreshing to see characters and people that wear their heart on their sleeves pretty much, um, and are bigger than life, but resonant with it, um, and encourage us to be bigger in a good way. I hope. Um, and as I said, year 5 and year 6 get it, and I've done poetry sessions with kids who have just heard the story, and the stuff they come out with is unbelievable. They easily step into the mythic stream. With us, I think sometimes it takes with grown-ups a little bit more of an effort. But it's still there and it's still really important. It's one of our wavelengths, and a wavelength that is dangerous, scary, deep, frightening. But it's also an entirely valid and very interesting way of negotiating this world that we happen to be in.
So you've been telling this story for over 20 years now.
This is
And um and I mean, I've got so many questions that I still want to ask. There's so many bits I want to delve into. It is just, I mean, I wouldn't, if I was asked, it wouldn't necessarily be one of the stories that I would pick as my soul stories, but I love that story. And there is so much in it and so much to talk about, so much to dig into and to come back to time and time again. Have have the things that really strike you about that story changed? Do you see it in a different way than you did 20 years ago?
Oh,
Has it
definitely.
grown as you've grown?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it was a massive act of hubris on my part to start telling it when I started telling it. So I can be a storyteller. I'll take this massive, very big thing that doesn't make any sense. It's full of death and blah, 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 and then whacked it around a bit, and then put it down for a while, and have done a fair bit of it in schools. But it wasn't until I did the show with Pauline. Pauline Downs, my wife, and she is a musician and singer, and that's the version for me because I enjoy telling it. I enjoy telling it to all audiences, but to have a female voice in this story, I think, is vital. Um, and so that is, we haven't done it for ages, probably not before lockdown, in fact. But we do want to bring it back. We want to revive it and take it out and about.
But you have recorded it, so I'm just going to put it out there that if you want to hear the whole story, and if you want to hear a woman's voice in it as well, and if you want to, because it is pretty epic, as you probably gathered from the bits that we haven't been able to tell you the whole story tonight. But you can get it as an MP3 or a CD from Michael's website, which
Actually, well, I don't. I've sold out of CDs. I need to get
oh
them all
no.
printed. So you've got to go for the download. I'm afraid.
Or pre-order, just deluge Michael with it. We need a CD. Get a reprint right now. But yeah, if you want it right now, you can have the MP3 version. um, I have got lots more things that I would love to dig into with you, but it is 9 o'clock, and I've totally failed to get to the Q&A. Now, there aren't any questions in the Q&A, and there's not very many in the chat because I think everybody has just been listening to you avidly. But I did promise other people that if they had burning questions that they wanted to ask you, then they could. So this is your chance. You'll have to be sort of keyboard ninja, get typing fast if there is anything that you really, really want to ask Michael before we wrap up for tonight. And I mean, I love how Welsh stories are connected with the landscape through language. And interesting, Mike West is asking, are you bilingual? Which,
Yes.
yeah. And so much of the Mabinogi and stories from the Mabinogion are bits of them are written onto the landscape, and you can trace parts of stories. And I imagine like kind of with the Raid of the Pigs, I did sort of sit down with the map one day and find all the places with Mochnant in the title, and kind of, you know, follow the thing. And I'm sure you could probably do that with the head. And knowing you probably have.
Well, actually, if you drive from Tenby to London, that's pretty much the journey.
So not so many Welsh place names are left on that route then now.
Not really.
But it is very much set in very specific places, and there is an atmosphere in those places, in those Welsh mountains, that is majestic and magical and changeable, very much with the weather, but with this solid rock beneath that is kind of makes you feel small within the bigness of the landscape, but also that there's a power beneath your feet, and that it's not happy, and it can be quite bleak, but it's beautiful and magical and magisterial, and that is the atmosphere of this story for me. It feels like the spirit of this story is the spirit of that land and that place. Absolutely.
And that the connection with the landscape is one of the things that messes with my head the most. So there's a place called Aberfraw, which is when they go back to Anglesey after from Ireland after everything has gone horribly wrong. They come ashore, so that's Branwen is still alive, and so is everyone else, and they walk into Anglesey.
Well, there are the
And
six of them.
yeah, and then yeah, of course, yeah, and then the men hang around to make camp, and Branwen keeps on going. She follows the Frau river, and then this weird thing happens. There's a horseshoe shaped kind of almost oxbow type thing, and in the bow of that shape, in the big U, there's a Neolithic burial tomb, Bronze Age. Sorry, Bronze Age isn't Neolithic. I think it's Bronze Age. Um, and that's called Beirdd Branwen. The story says that she went away from the group, lay down, her heart broken, she died. But just up the river from the place where they landed in Aberfraw, there is this place called Beirdd Branwen, and it was dug up. Archaeologists came and had a rummage around, and they found these Bronze Age cremations. And so it was like a pot full of bones, and on the top were ear bones, deliberately placed on top of the pot. Like, Branwen's ear bones. What? And that these are listening organs, and we are storytellers, and this landscape, and it's just too big, too wide, too deep for us to make academic or literal sense of it. It's just we just have to be there, recognize it, listen, and hope some of it rubs off.
I think that is the perfect sentiment to finish off. Richard saying it wonderful. Thank you. Spellbinding, as I said. There are requests for you to get a CD reprinted.
I know, right?
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your soul story with us.
Absolute pleasure, and I think the format you've got here is absolute because it knocks me out of my normal way of doing things because you ask really good questions, and so hats off to you and the team. It's a really, really great way to both tell stories and have a dig around at the same time, and do both well.
Thank you. Well, we're going to keep going on that note. So the next one will be it's February. It's Tuesday, the 6th of February. So it's usually the first Tuesday of the month. I will be putting up soon on my Patreon site who my guest is, and then a little bit closer to the time, I'll be putting it out generally. You're very welcome to join my Patreon site if you would like to. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel where there are lots of other other episodes with lots of fabulous people and different themes of the evening. Michael, where can people see you next? Online
Um,
and in person?
I don't have a huge amount in the diary right now. I'm doing mainly schools work, and I'm also directing quite a lot. So some of you might have come across Philip Quady's show, The Gods Are All Here. I helped him with that, and there were a couple of other shows. Oh, Carl Goff, if any of you know Carl Goff, he's got a new show called Nexus. That's one of mine as well. So I'm desperate to get back to doing my own show. So there will be a Lady of the Lake show. That'll be me and the irrepressible Stacey Blythe and the amazing dancer Eva Maria Mutka, bilingual performance. It will We're going to start working on it soon, but it's going to be touring towards the beginning of autumn.
Well, that is definitely something to look forward to. Fantastic. And this is a very international audience we've got here. We've got Tanya's in from New Zealand, we've got people in from America and all over. So, but this is the thing, is you do amazing workshops, and you are still doing some of those online, and you can mentor online, which I would thoroughly recommend. If you are looking for a mentor or a director, then Michael is your man. And I think that's it for all of our notes tonight. Just to say thank you all for coming, for sharing this space with us, for digging into Branwen. Go and listen to Branwen now, or even read it. I mean, I would recommend listening to Pauline and Michael telling it. But it is worth reading and exploring as well, and digging into the whole of the Mabinogi. It's such a wonderful cycle of story. But for now, wherever and whenever you are listening to this, thank you for being with us. Thank you very much to my fantastic guest, Michael Harvey, for helping me to take the tradition on.